Good morning, everyone. Can can you please request everyone to get your tea and have your seat, please? And as you would see, we are packed. We'll be even more packed. So could you please make sure that there's space for people to go inside and remove your bags from the chair? In fact, I have to start with this. We have, I don't know what your experience with Eventbrite is. It depends upon pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, but my experience has been that 200 register and sometimes 20 turn up, sometimes 50, sometimes 100. So this is very difficult to make a calculation. In our case, it seems we have got at least half of the people turning up. But it also implies that there are more people who will be coming later. So we'd have to be ready for that. That's a good success because, of course, the more people there are, we'll have better conversation. But it's also very important for us to stick to the time. So we are quite clear that that's why we start at 10. That will, we have from 10 to 10:15 is our part. Then we have the next session. We have next session. Just housekeeping rules for toilets, restroom, whatever you call, wherever you come from, you have to go downstairs. There's a possibility, or go upstairs. We have got all kinds of toilets, including gender-neutral toilets. Downstairs, you have to go one floor down. Fire exits are there. You just follow us, and we leave there in case there's a fire alarm. We shouldn't have it. But I have to let you know that's there. What else? Is there anything else I need to? Any other safety, health? No. Take care of yourself and take care of each other. That's a basic thing to say, right? Because I often forget that. Now, let me start. Some of you may know me, most of you will not know me, and you don't need to know me, except that I'm one of the colleagues who has organized this conference. I'm Dibyesh, Professor Dibyesh Anand. I'm the head of School of Social Sciences, but the reason I'm here is, of course, because I'm passionate about it, but also because I'm the co-chair of university's EDI committee, Equality, Diversity, Inclusion Committee. This is the second conference we are doing. We had one last year. But before I go on more, I'll invite Deputy Vice Chancellor Professor Alex Hughes, who's also my fellow co-conspirator, co-chair of EDI committee.
Thank you, Dibyesh. Good morning, everyone. Apologies for speaking from the floor. I've got a wonky knee. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the University of Westminster to what, as Dibyesh says, is our second anti-racism conference. It's a proud moment, I think, for us here. This is the fruit of, I would say, 3 years of really consistent, really focused equality, diversity and inclusion work at the University of Westminster. It's always been part of our DNA, but the focus in the last 3 years has ramped up very, very significantly and very collaboratively across the university. So there are many people here, including people from our student union, who have been part of that very hard and very consistent work. And it's been work that's been driven by a recognition of the importance of equity. We talk a lot in higher education about inclusion, but we can have no inclusion unless we recognise that some differences are more different than others, and that attention to difference is a really important part of work. So I think that as we move forward into the future, that emphasis on equity, on the recognition of difference, on the enabling of the areas where difference is prejudicial is going to be critical to our work. I don't really want to say anything else. We've got a fantastic programme. I think it attests to the depth of and breadth of the anti-racist work at Westminster. It's a very nuanced programme. It's a very segmented programme. We really want lots of interaction throughout the day rather than everyone having to sit about being talked at. So we've got a conversational format, and we really want to make sure that's a conversation that involves everybody, not simply the people on the panels. I think the last thing I want to say is that it's a proud moment for me personally to be here. I think that we all have different investments in this agenda, and when I think about my own personal investment, my mind always goes back to a maternal uncle in British India who was deemed too brown for the family photographs, and I think that that's something which makes me think a lot about the importance of this work and what a kind of different environment we're in these days, but how much work remains to be done. So thanks very much. I'm going to hand back to Dibyesh, who's going to talk about the programme, and I hope everyone has a lovely day. I'm sure we will.
Thank you, Alex, for this. And I said co-conspirator, rather than co-chair of the university's EDI committee. But that's my style of speaking, and you have to get used to it. But part of this part of the reason I also said it is because for those of us, and I'm assuming I'm preaching to the converted in one sense, not that I preach anyone, I'm not a preacher at all, right? I have no interest in being a missionary of any kind. But we do know that when we are doing EDI kind of work, now we may have our own critiques of EDI. We may think it's too radical or not radical enough. EDI is not better than decolonizing. Decolonizing is better than diversifying. These are the debates that will continue. I don't think there's ever going to be a clear answer. But whenever we do this kind of EDI work, we do know, and those of us involved are very clear that it involves a lot of personal, what people use the word emotional labor, but personal experience, emotional labor. So I was yesterday at another university talking on something else, on Athena Swan, and we were having a discussion. So it was quite, let's say, a very managed discussion to start with. But then once I did ask that question, and I was speaking to colleagues later, that how come most people in the audience were women? How would we bring about, how does one challenge sexism or misogyny in university context where most people who seem to be interested in doing that are women? And where are the men in the picture, right? So that's the kind of discussion we had. And then it turned into something what all discussions ought to be. A more honest and frank reflection on institutions, but also on ourselves. So as I introduced myself as Dibyesh Anand, the reason I'm interested in this subject is this is not my research. I haven't researched on race per se. EDI is, well, I do the EDI work. That's not my role, and that's not my job. This is my politics and passion. My own work has largely been around issues of what people will call social justice. I'll say political justice, because I've worked on Tibetans occupied by China, so it's colonial occupation. I've worked on Uyghurs. I've worked on Kashmiris. I've worked on Islamophobia in India. So very different subjects. In UK context, I always notice that the term often used for these things is social justice. But we know we are not talking social justice, we are talking of political justice. So there's almost a reluctance in scholarship, academia, funding bodies to talk of political justice rather than social justice. So the reason I come to doing this is because for me, of course, issues of recognizing, acknowledging, identifying, challenging, working together to challenge even better, all forms of racism is part and parcel of, from my personal perspective, a journey of political justice rather than only social justice. So now I'm saying social versus political doesn't mean they're completely opposite, but you know what I mean, that it's very much political thing we have to do. We can't build universities that are perfect. No university is perfect. We can't have a higher education that is challenging sexism, racism, homophobia, ableism perfectly and not deal with the society. Because we all are ultimately members of all kinds of societies. So what in my experience I've noticed is higher education sector is generally, ups and downs are there. There are all kinds of problems, we know it. But there's a seriousness, that's at least my experience, there's a seriousness in tackling all kinds of prejudices, that's there. But there's not enough done to intervene in debates taking place in wider society, in the wider world about the same things. And I do think we need to get better at it. So last year when we had our first, we didn't call it Challenging Racism in Higher Education. I think we called it first Anti-Racism Conference or Building an Anti-Racist University Conference. We had it last year. Some of you were there, most of you were not here. That was the first conference we did. The purpose was to look at, again, not how to be not a racist, but how to be anti-racist within institutions. We do acknowledge, and those of you who would be racialized minorities, you know what I'm talking about, that there are trends when we become the favored subjects and then the trends disappear. After 2020, with George Floyd's murder, most universities are talking about anti-racism, challenging racism. Then in 2-3 years' time, not all of them are doing the same. So if you do come from university, do pay attention to what is happening. Now, I'm here as a co-chair of University's EDI committee, but I'm also here as the chair of EDI network of London Higher. London Higher is an organization that includes all London-based universities. So when I was having interaction there, and I've just started only early this year, I was very clear that it's not about what are we doing right, but the risk of any kind of anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic, and these kinds of work is that it becomes about image rather than substance. So what should we do so that we look right, we look good? So I can tell you and reassure you after you've heard Alex and myself that the purpose of this conference is to not make us look good. And I can assure you on that again, that the idea is not how good we are doing, it is about what good things take place, what good things are not taking place, and what can be done better. And I said, this is not my area of work. Many of you might be experts on this, right? In fact, Islamophobia is the only thing I've worked on in my own research work. But I can say this, that we can only move forward, move better, and become better if we acknowledge that there are problems. We haven't got it right all the time. But we also need to be kind to ourselves and each other, where we work together to make sure that we have conversations, we have actions, and we have change, hopefully for better in the future. I added hopefully, because who knows, if you follow US politics, we thought Trump is gone. Okay, I don't know what's your politics, that how can Trump ever come to power? Okay, then he came to power. Then Trump is gone, good riddance. Then who knows, he might come back to power. So that's why I said, hopefully change for better. But what we do understand is we work very intersectionally. So if you look at the program today, you'd find different panels, different themes, but all driven by one single idea that racism is unacceptable. Racism has to be identified. Racism has to be challenged. And we cannot challenge unless we also challenge ourselves and challenge it together. So that's a broader introduction to the university. Is there anything else I need to say? No, nothing, because we have got the next session on time. May I invite Dr. Deborah Husbands there? Yep. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Sorry, could we just get some people to move forward, because there's a lot more people at the back, and because of health and safety and that, we can't bring more chairs in. So if some people could move forward, and then people at the back can just sort of take a seat at the back, is that okay?
Or people at the back can just come in front and sit.
They could, but they're sort of not coming in. Sorry about that.
Okay, but I just took longer. I knew that 10:15. I'll introduce you.
You're going to introduce me?
Yeah, who will introduce you?
This is the room.
Okay.
Can I get someone to go?
Please, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Deborah, what time does Deborah's one have to finish?
Uh-huh.
What time should it finish?
I'll check.
11:30. So I'll tell her when she's got
Just keep my position up.
Now, can I please ask those who are quite shy, well, not shy, maybe you're reluctant to sit in front, please. These are equally good chairs. And
That's why you're a professor.
yeah,
They didn't want to move forward, and you're saying actually they should come forward.
okay. So on that note, I said we have stuck to time. That's why, the reason I was going on and on, because I realized we are starting next session at 10:15. So I wanted to give my colleague, Dr. Deborah Husbands, the chance to then have a panel here. I realized that, of course, who will introduce Deborah? She'll introduce the panel, but possibly no one will introduce Deborah. So let me introduce Deborah to you. I have a feeling that many of you would know her or may know of her. If you haven't known her, then there's a loss for you. You really need to know her. Now, in fact, if there was a personal story, which I'll take 45 seconds to say, that which is behind a lot of work I'm personally doing on EDI-related stuff, I was inspired by Deborah. As I was doing my own work outside the university, not within the university, working with her. Dr. Deborah Husbands is a co-chair of Black and Minority Ethnic Network of our university. I'll tell you what, she's in psychology within a School of Social Sciences at University of Westminster. She has a lot of responsibilities, a lot of achievements, but something for which you may not understand. Do you know what a reader is? Not a reader means reading a book, right? Now, in university context, if you're from US background, you'll not understand it. That's associate professor for you. But Deborah has been appointed as a reader in psychology from this year. So can I join you? So that's Deborah, the reader.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good, great. So it's really interesting with the reader thing, because I called my family in the States and I said, guess what? I'm a reader. And they said, you mean you can read now? So, yeah, anyway. It's really great to be here this morning, and whenever I sit in a setting where I see black women, I get really excited, really excited, and I know that these black women will have some wonderful stories to tell us about their experiences. I say wonderful, obviously it's going to be the reality, the truth of their experience. So, black woman. It's a problem, isn't it? For some. Exotic black woman. Fetishized black woman. Angry black woman. Aggressive black woman. Black woman. Inspirational black woman. Leading black woman. Black woman. I have 4 on the panel, and I'm going to introduce them to you. So, I'm never good with my right and left, so right at the end there, we have Carlette Norwood. So Carlette is a sociology lecturer, she's a trainer, and a PhD mentor with expertise in cultural intelligence and racial hierarchy or literacy. Her research focuses on racism, racial inequality, and racial trauma, and she specializes in microaggression and historical racial trauma. Next to her, we have Yaz. So Yaz is an EDI lead and senior leader at the University of Westminster. Her current research projects include studies into the BAME attainment gap. Note I didn't say BAME. And of course, we know that racialized terminology is problematic, and we constantly need to be deconstructing that. She's also involved in inclusive teaching and navigating higher education for black academic and social media use and racially minoritized academics. And then we have Cheyenne. So Cheyenne Holborough is a British Caribbean currently working at the University of Westminster Students' Union. How many Students' Union people do we have in the room? We have a few. These are your people, Cheyenne. So she's an academic representation coordinator, and having been in a variety of EDI roles, Cheyenne continues her EDI work in her new role at the SU. And then finally, we have Rutendo Musikavanhu. Yes. Thank you. I don't know if any of you saw, is it Shola's post where she tried to get someone to say her name? Right, good. Okay, she's a senior lecturer and course leader on the MA Event Design and Management MA Tourism courses. Over the years, Rutendo has taught at university level. She's published peer-reviewed research and has presented and participated at over a dozen conferences, including the prestigious Regional Studies Association Annual Conference and the Association for Events Management Education. Okay, so now we know our panel. So when I thought about this panel, and of course the important work that we're going to be looking at here is how we can kind of consider anti-black racism. As Deborah said, there are so many different racisms, so we're going to focus in on anti-black racism. And I came across this really interesting article from Ajnes Prasad, and I don't know if he's familiar to you, if his work is familiar to you. But the article is entitled, "What is the Real Perversity of Racism?" It's a recent article, and he states this. He says, "I understand how racism is codified into the institutions, the structures, and the organizations that configure how we confer status and value onto one another. I equally understand how racism yields differential outcomes in health, education, housing, and myriad other critical aspects of life. So as much as he sort of centralized the ideology or the concept of racism, he recognizes that racism plays out in different ways across different contexts. And for us this morning, we want to look at anti-black racism as one of these specifically because it comes with a distinct set of experiences. And that might be very different to other forms of racism. Now, Fanon explains that the experience of anti-black racism can even lead to a form of self-hate as the ultimate form of derogation. So we know that this is a critical, lived and living experience, and it's something that we want to unpack this morning. So using a series of questions, and then we're going to conclude the panel by giving you the opportunity to ask some questions. I want to ask the first question. So what's your understanding or your experience of anti-black racism? In what ways has this shaped your experience in higher education? And you might want to reflect on your journey into higher education while you're here, going through, and where you are right now. So in what ways has this kind of affected your understanding, your experience? So I'm going to start with Carlette.
Thank you, Deborah. I really thought about that question and probably don't have a typical response for that because anti-black racism to me falls into yet another labeling, another box to contain us. It centers black people as victims. And to me, it's not about anti-black racism, it's about white supremacy. And I choose not to shift the focus because it makes it sound like there's something wrong or something that we need to fix or something that we need to address. It's, again, victimizing black people, in my opinion. And the real focus should be on white supremacy and white privilege and white entitlement. So racism is a complex system, we know that, and it should be attacked from the inside out and not from the outside in. And I really thought about that question, and I that's my position. It's just like reverse racism to me. There is no such thing. So there is racism. We know that to be true. And whether it's anti-black or whatever, it's not the problem of those who experience the racism to be able to have to call it out.
Thank you.
I mean, for me, anti-black racism centres around racism in relation to black people, and it manifests itself in quite a few ways. You know, the disproportionate amount of black women who are dying in childbirth, the amount of unemployment that we see with black people, the attainment gap, well, the achievement gap, the awarding gap, however you want to call it. There are lots of different ways in which we see anti-black racism manifest itself, and for me, in terms of higher education, it's made me very hyper-vigilant of instances where I see inequality related to black students, related to black academics, and it's one of the motivators that motivated me, pushed me to, I'll just mention my Facebook group, which many people here already know, BAMWA, which is Black, Asian, Minoritized Ethnic Women in Academia, which pushed me to start that up, because a lot of the people that I've spoken to, black women, black academics, black men, have experienced this racism within higher education. And they need the support. I will allude to that later on. They need this peer support from co-ethnic networks in order to survive and thrive within higher education. And it's something that needs to be brought out, because as Deborah rightly said, you know, there are different forms of racism, you know, different types of racism, and it's felt differently. You know, and I think, you know, that's one of the main problems with the umbrella term of BAME, it conflates a whole lot of difference. And a lot of the time when we're looking at black people, there are worse outcomes. And BAME kind of covers that. It hides a multitude of sins. That's what I always say with BAME. And it's just so problematic. That's my take anyway.
To kind of echo what's already been said, you often see in higher education that out of any other type of racism, anti-black racism is the one that gets glossed over. It has the slowest progress, if sometimes any progress at all. And those issues are kind of put on the back burner, whereas any other type of racism is allowed to make progress and is allowed to have their voice heard way more than a black person would in an academic context.
So for me, I think it affects how you show up in your lived world, so how you interpret yourself, how you perhaps mute yourself. I feel like I have to do a face-on, face-off a lot of the time and have to really think through how I show up in different spaces because it affects how people might perceive me correctly or incorrectly, whether they've actually thought of it or not. And in the workspace, I also think it informs how I show up for my students as an ally. And I find that I often have to go the extra mile for ethnic minority students because I feel that they don't have a champion oftentimes. And there are stereotypes that are lauded upon them that are unfair sometimes. And you sit in meetings and you hear some very shocking things said. And oftentimes I think to myself, just a few years ago, people like me wouldn't even be in these meetings. I was a student myself on the other side. Who used to champion me? Who used to actually think of me? Nobody probably thought about that. And if people are still saying these things and I have to sit there and go, wait a minute, I think that's a little unfair. You need to think that through, or you need to think of that individual as a student and not just a student from a particular region. So for me, it also goes beyond just black, right? It goes to also thinking of African black because I'm an African black person. And I feel an added layer because as compared to perhaps Caribbean black, etc., sometimes we're perceived as less than an additional layer. And it's really, really difficult sometimes having to prove yourself over and over again in different spaces.
Thank you. I want to jump on something that you've just said because, as you know, we had the murder of George Floyd in 2020. And a number of people sort of, I call it sort of re-identified themselves as allies. And you mentioned the term ally. I'm going off script here. So, what is an ally for you? What is an ally? Anyone wants to take that question?
That is the new catchword, I'm an ally. And, allies can't be self-appointed. You cannot say that you're an ally. You have to be invited to the picnic. You just can't show up with your basket. And allyship goes beyond the performative. To be a true ally, you have to be willing to put your body on the line. You have to be willing to jump in and stop active racism as it happens. You have to be willing to put your job on the line. And you can sit there and say, oh, I have black friends though. But do you really? Or do you just know black people? Because think about your friends in your life. Friends go to dinner together, they go over to each other's house, they pick up their kids from school, they hang out together, they know each other's lives. I have friends, I have colleagues, and I have associates. So when you talk about allyship, you're really talking about friendship. You're talking about ride or die. You're talking about going the extra mile, standing up to your boss and say, I think this company has some inadequate policies about EDI, racism, challenging your friends. Because we all know that when white people get together, if there's a racist in the group, they just automatically think that other white people are on board with their racist comments. They'll make a racist comment and kind of wink, wink, thinking that everybody's on board. A real ally will stand up to that person and say, that's not cool to say that, It's not cool to show up in the pub with your friends and to make jokes, You're not welcome here. That's allyship. And if you aren't doing that, then you aren't a true ally. You might be a supporter, you might be an empathizer, but you should not call yourself an ally.
I think that's so important to resituate this understanding of ally, because so many people claimed allyship. It was almost like the allyship club. You know, everybody was kind of, I'm there, I'm supporting you. But when it came to upstanding, which I think is what you're talking about, very few people had the confidence or the conviction to do that. So thank you so much for that. And I want everyone in the room to just think about that for a minute. Because at some point you may have said, I am an ally, or you have some sort of understanding. But I think this is an excellent example of what allyship is, what it means, and what it should be. Does anyone else want to add a comment?
I mean, if I were to add to that, I would say allyship should be open to everybody, right? I tend to find that it's subjected to an insider, right? So let's say you're in a room and there's a number of black people, and you happen to have maybe a position in that space. As the black person, it's automatic that you assume that you're going to be the ally of those students because you come from the same social order or ethnic order as them, right? Whereas, why does it always have to be me who supports the black students? Why can't it be somebody else in the team who's equally qualified, who can also be an ally? I don't have to be an insider of that group to be an ally to someone. I think we can all take a lesson from what's been said here in terms of how we show up and support each other despite our ethnic orders and how we might identify with the people in the room.
Absolutely, thank you. So this leads nicely, actually, onto something that happens in, sort of lived experience or work context, and it's the subject of the microaggression, which I think most of you should have an understanding of. But in brief, it's that kind of subtle, nuanced thing, word, action, whatever behavior that is done, and it leaves you second-guessing. Did that happen? Was that said? Am I hearing this correctly? And often it is a perpetuation of violence against an individual, but done in a very sophisticated form. So, my question is that although we talk about this less, and of course, the gathering of microaggressions amounts to an actual racial attack, what about your own experience of microaggressions? How have you dealt with that? Because they're harder to tackle in some respects than overt modern forms of racism. So what's your take on microaggressions? And I know this is the subject of your work, Carlette.
Microaggressions are the most insidious forms of racism because and there are three types of microaggressions. There's microassaults, which are the very basic in-your-face, the racial epithets, the symbols of racism and oppression. And then micro-insults, which are more the cultural, more cultural attacks and stereotypes. And then micro-invalidations, which can sometimes come from even a position of support. You might think that you're helping someone through a micro-invalidation. For example, I come to you and I say, Bob is a racist. And in your attempt to support me, you say, oh no, Bob's not a racist. He's just a jerk to everybody. Well, okay, Bob might be a jerk, but he's also a racist. So by you saying he's not, you've just invalidated my experience, because I can guarantee you I know what racism is because I experience it regularly. So to say that he's not is just a micro-invalidation of my experience. But microaggressions to me are more damaging because they are psychological and they really trigger trauma, ongoing manifestations of maladies, physical reactions like depression, anxiety, sleeplessness, anger, weight loss, hair loss, just anything you can imagine. It manifests very similarly to PTSD. But also, you can walk away from a microaggressive event and not be really sure what happened. You can walk away from it thinking like, did that really happen? And that is more damaging than somebody who walks up to you and calls you a bad name, because you walk away feeling dehumanized and not sure of yourself, which then leaks into your self-esteem and your self-worth.
Yeah, I want to just talk about my experience of racial microaggressions in higher education. I've got about 5 different examples, and I think the first one was when I started my PhD. And my supervisor said to me, Yaz, you don't need to write so complicatedly. You know, I know that you're a black woman and you're young. And I was like, what's that got to do with anything? You know, I'm doing a PhD. This is just the way that I write. What's my race, you know, my age got to do with anything? You know, and it's something that stopped me in my tracks at the time. I don't think I kind of thought about it. It was like probably 20 minutes later that I was absolutely livid. You know, that's just one example. Another example was, I suppose Deborah mentioned earlier about the angry or the aggressive black woman. You know, I was in a role a few years ago, and I've got twins, and they're still quite young. And I was timetabled to work very late. And I said, you know, please could you change this because I've got to pick up my kids. You know, I was very reasonable, very calm. But the next day, a black colleague said to me, so-and-so said that you were really aggressive. Again, you know, I wasn't being aggressive at all. These are all like textbook examples of what's happened. You know, another example is in meetings. Silenced in meetings. Or talked over in meetings. You know, and all of this chips away. It hurts. It frustrates. It angers. You know, sometimes, you know, it's so insidious. It really is. It's like you're mixing a pot and you're putting more salt and poison into it. It's insidious. And we go through it on an everyday basis. An everyday basis. And it's what we do with that, with the impact of that, is what either helps us to thrive or go under. But I can't emphasize enough just how painful microaggressions are. You know, microinvalidations are awful.
I think you get a sense of that. Yeah.
I've experienced a number of microaggressions since I've been in higher education, but the ones that stuck with me in particular was when I had the first day of my course, and we were going around like talking about ourselves, introducing ourselves, and the question came up, where are you from? And of course everybody else is saying, oh, I'm from London, I'm from Wales, but as soon as it would get to someone of colour, okay, I'm from London. Okay, but where are your parents from? Or it would be like a pause, as if to wait for the country. And at the time, because I had a very sheltered childhood, so I didn't even really like understand the idea of even being black until secondary school, until the idea of like being light skin, dark skin. Like I got called quarter caste once. It was, yeah, but. Hearing like, where are you from, and then having to explain that my parents are from the Caribbean, and then they just move on to the next person. They go, I'm from Wales, and then just move on. Didn't sit right with me, and I couldn't understand why. And then another time, someone asked me, another classic question, can I touch your hair?
That's a no-no, yes?
Mm-hmm. And again, another situation where I didn't really realize it was a microaggression. So I let it happen, but again, it didn't feel right. And then they asked me if it was real. As if, as a black woman, if you have a really long hair, it can't possibly be yours. There's no way it could be yours. And now that I know what microaggressions are, it's just like, it's something that like runs around in your head all the time, like, oh, I should have said this, I should have said that. There was someone around, why didn't they say something, you know? It's something that even when the situation is over, even when you do have the tools to combat it, it will haunt you.
I think I will follow on with the hair one. That was what I was going to talk about. I had a colleague actually last year. I came to work, and my own natural hair, this is not my hair, by the way, is an afro, so an afro puff, 4C hair. So I decided, okay, I'm going to wear my hair in an afro puff, neatly, obviously. Went to work, and a colleague said, actually, they didn't ask. At least somebody asked you to touch your hair. They just came and touched my hair. And so I looked at them with a shocking look, like, what are you doing? You're invading my private space, and why would you touch my hair? So I actually then said to them, why have you done that? Oh, I just wanted to feel if your hair was like wire, or if it was like candy floss. I just wanted to know whether the texture was, different. But you just came and touched my hair. If I was to do that to your hair and just say, oh, I want to feel if your hair is silky or like straw, I don't think you would take that in the same light. So I tried to articulate that to my colleague, and my colleague actually looked at me like, you're problematic. Somebody else was in the room, and they also looked at me as if you're making a big deal out of nothing. But, I mean, that was an incident that happened, and it's happened to me multiple times. I'm pretty sure most black women can identify with that. It sits with you, and I remember thinking, okay, I was still new to the team at that point, and I was thinking to myself, maybe I need to show up different. And so I actually started muting myself. And I actually didn't wear my own natural hair for about a year, and I started wearing straight wigs, bone straight Brazilian hair, so that I could just blend in with my colleagues and be less about my hair and about me. And then I got to a point where I said, why do I have to change myself to fit in? Why can't I just be accepted as I am? And why does my hair have to define who I am? Because the next thing, you start overthinking it. The next thing is, maybe she's that way because of her hair, or she's unkempt, and all other kinds of things that start coming up, and you start almost second-guessing yourself. You don't speak up in meetings, you don't speak up in places because you're thinking, oh, they've already judged me because they're looking at my hair that is, of a particular texture.
This issue, and I dare any of you to touch my hair. This issue of hair is really interesting, and in fact, there's a long kind of colonial history around hair. And I remember, even when I was coming into academia, and I have locks, natural locks, and my mum saying to me, they're not going to accept you when your hair is like this. So even within our own sort of people, our own cultures, we hold on to these deep-rooted colonial ideas about what is good and right and valuable and available, etc. And I want to kind of go back to something that you said, Cheyenne, in terms of how you're judged by the Pantone of your skin. So we know that in historical and present-day society, whiteness is constructed as valuable. And everyone else is potentially othered. And the closer one's proximity to whiteness is the more acceptable you are considered. I came across a term, perhaps you can help me with this one, Dibyesh. So gore. So gore, it's a Hindu term for, how do I pronounce it? Gore. It's a Hindu term for light-skinned or white people, and it governs those who do the cleaning and those who are cleaned for. So right across, and we think about our house staff, we think about, sort of people at the sharp end, as it were. So right across society, we've got these kind of ideologies around what is acceptable based on the color of one's skin. Now, given the Pantone makeup of our institutions and the valorization of whiteness, what should our institutions do? What should our universities do to challenge racism more effectively? And I'm going back to anti-black because I want to specifically just stay with it, and I know, the contestation around that term. But what can our universities do to challenge racism more effectively?
I think for me, first and foremost, it needs to acknowledge that it exists. And it needs to acknowledge the extent of why it exists, and speak to the people who have experienced it. And that doesn't mean just quantitative research, it means qualitative research, understanding their lived experiences within the institution itself. It needs to be self-reflexive in terms of its practices and processes, to examine whether or not its practices and processes are inherently racist or bias against, for example, black people. That's the issue that we're talking about right now. And we already have what is called the Race Equality Charter, which does look at race equality within institutions, but that in itself has some problems. You know, so the institutions itself need to get independent bodies to examine the practices and processes. You know, not somebody internal, somebody external who's going to be doing this. You know, in addition to that, I think universities themselves, there's quite a few different organisations that are run by black people who aim to empower black academics, black students to progress and thrive within higher education. And they also do consultancy as well. These are some of the kinds of institutions, some of the kind of organisations that universities could commission to do this work. You know, it's rather than focusing on the usual suspects such as advanced HE, it's time to move away from that and look at different types of entities that can help universities to challenge the anti-black racism that obviously exists.
I think, again, that they definitely need to acknowledge it. Coming in today to the university, I saw that there was a flag for the coronation. And I feel like if you're doing all this EDI work and you're doing all this research and then you put that flag outside, especially when you're having a conference like this, I think it really contradicts the work you're trying to do, given how we all know, hopefully that we all know the history behind the monarchy, but also that I think the universities need to treat black issues in the same way that you would treat any other issue. Because even in my own experience, I've seen and heard too many times about professors saying some outrageous things, including the N-word, and only getting a slap on the wrist.
Thank you. So, I'm going back to Prasad's work. He describes this for some as the hybrid identity problematic. And we may have heard this described as being a coconut. So you're white on the inside, but you're very black on the outside. South Asians also refer to this as Oreo for similar reasons. So what advice would you give to other black women? Let's stay with the intersection of race and gender here, who are entering or you know, they're looking to kind of enter, or they're currently in higher education, and they want to retain their cultural identity as a black woman. They don't want to be seen as white on the inside, black on the outside. They don't want to be passing. They don't want to be wearing sort of Eurocentric hairstyles in order to fit in, because for black women, it's not so much about belonging, it's about fitting in, and those are two very different constructs. So what advice would you give to women who want to kind of retain their cultural identity without feeling they have to, quote unquote, normalize it?
I'd say that as a person who has been called coconut and someone who's been told they're very articulate for someone of their background, and someone who's been told that I'm too black to be with the black kids and too white to be with the white kids. I'd say after having that internal battle for years and sometimes still having it, take up as much space as you can. Just do what you want, because being black is not a box. It's not one square and you check that and magically you have a black card or something, I don't know. But it's being who you are, accepting that, and accepting there are so many different facets to who you are and who you can be.
Thank you. Rutendo?
I think I would add to that by saying that use your individuality as your strength. Let that speak for who you are. Be yourself. Don't be scared to be yourself. Don't mute yourself. Don't turn yourself down. I mean, I've had incidences where I've been told in the workspace by colleagues that you're different. This wasn't here, it was at a previous university, but you're not like the others. And I asked, what do you mean by you're not like the others? Well, you don't bring certain foods to work. That was happening in a canteen. You don't speak in that way. And I would get, quote unquote, the privilege of being invited to after work drinks because I was different. And then I realized this was because I went to school in Switzerland and I did a lot more, quote unquote, privileged things, like, go for rowing and do other socially acceptable things that are different that perhaps my peers had not experienced. So in that way, I was more acceptable or deemed more like, not white passing per se, because I'm not white passing, but in terms of my life experiences, they lent me an opportunity to be more accepted in certain social groups that other people weren't accepted in. And I think when you find yourself in that position, you actually also need to speak up and say, wait a minute, that is not correct. Just because I've had, quote unquote, this privilege to go to a particular school, to have been able to go and experience these things, doesn't mean I am different from others. And what do you mean by others as well?
I have to agree with everything that everybody said. I've had people say to me, oh, Carlette, you're so articulate. You aren't like most black people. I mean, I've actually had that said to me, or you don't behave like black people. Well, don't let the light skin fool you, because I am definitely a black woman, and I will not be put into a box. There is no blanket description that describes all of us. And I would just advise to, again, be your authentic self. Be who you are. Don't fit into any box. If you're more comfortable listening to death metal, then go for it. Don't feel like you can't listen to country music. Be your authentic self. And I think that is how I have survived, just being myself. And that's what I would encourage black women coming in. But I think more importantly, which I had to do when I started postgraduate work, was finding a network and a mentor. And that is not, I don't think, our students aren't advised that enough. They need to find a mentor, a black woman who has made it, who has gone through the challenges, the hassles, that can guide that young person, help them navigate through white spaces, and unfortunately, what to say and what not to say, and how to behave, and code switch if necessary. That is a reality. We don't want to do it, but we have to do it if we're going to survive, especially in the academy. So that's what I would advise.
Thank you.
I just want to reiterate what's been said. I think the most important thing is finding a mentor or a coach, somebody who has been through all the things that you are going to go through, who can guide you, give you access to that social capital that a lot of the time that we don't necessarily have. And it's not to do with any kind of deficit, it's just that maybe we don't have somebody in our family who have gone before us to, do a PhD, for example. And those are the kind of things that can separate somebody who's just graduated from a PhD to get their first full-time position to somebody who's just graduated to a PhD, and then they do a job that isn't of the level that they would expect. And that's what we tend to see in terms of, compared to black PhDs and white PhDs, because the white PhD students usually have access to those kind of things. Another thing I would say is to be yourself. And I'm always myself, like me or don't, I'm going to be myself. Even at school, I was listening to ABBA, I was listening to Queen, whereas my friends were listening to Jodeci. So for me, I'm always going to be myself. And I think it's very important to try and have that conviction of knowing that you are enough. You don't need to try and change. And this also is even when you're in the classroom. Be yourself, obviously, transmit that information, build the rapport with students, be the best lecturer, teacher, educator that you can be. But don't try and pretend to be something that you're not, because it's going to be tiring. In addition, with dealing with the microaggressions, the racism, the prejudice, and all the other things, the stereotypes that you have, not being your authentic self is going to be even more cutting to you. Because what happens when you go to bed? You've got migraines, your hair's falling out, you know, you're at the doctor for depression, whatever. These are the kind of things that it manifests itself in if you aren't yourself. I think, you know, another thing on the back of that is finding an outlet for the stresses and strains so you can be yourself. Meditation is a really good thing. I love meditation. Running is another thing that you can do. And just to co-sign what Carlette said, networks. When I was doing my PhD, when I graduated, it was 2006. We didn't really have much of a social media kind of thing then. It was quite in its infancy. It did exist, of course, but we didn't have like really strong Facebook. It had just kind of started. You know, one of the things that I wish that I had was a strong network. But I was lucky because I have a strong black family who were at the end of the phone all the time to help me when I was screaming about my supervisor, screaming about my, you know, other people that were supposed to be allies getting more teaching than me, you know, and, you know, they weren't really standing up for what was going on in terms of my experience, you know, but networks are very, very important, you know, for you to be able to feedback, for peer support, for you to actually sense check, you know, if you're having those microaggressions, you're having the passive-aggressive situations that you have on a daily basis, for you to sense check with people who understand and have your lived experience. These are the things that really help and will nurture you.
I just wanted to add something to that idea of being yourself and how I think that can actually improve the learning experience for students. I think it's important when you show up as your true, authentic self because your students will also be able to show up as their true, authentic selves. And when you bring your own lived stories to the classroom, it actually enhances the learning experience. I've found that personally, I love teaching from case study examples from where I come from. So I'm from sub-Saharan Africa, and I will always use case examples that come from where I come from. And I've had several students over the years that have come to me and thanked me for using different examples that are not the common, textbook examples that they get. I thrive off that, looking for, instead of talking about Coachella, maybe let's talk about Afro Nation in Ghana. Instead of, talking about Burning Man, maybe let's talk about Rihanna's Super Bowl event, and use different examples and challenge students to think about them from a different perspective. And it's not only just the ethnic minority students that have appreciated that, because most of my students aren't actually from an ethnic minority background. It's all my other students still who are like, wow, thank you for bringing different examples, and this has opened up my mind. I've learned something about a different culture, and I appreciate that. So I think use what may be deemed as a different quality in yourself to enhance the learning journey for the students as well.
Thank you. And before we move to our last question, I just want to share with you a moment when I experienced a microaggression. At least that's how I interpreted it. And it was on the back of my appointment as a reader. And someone said to me, isn't it interesting that the university would allow something like this to happen? And I was shocked. And I was so shocked, I didn't respond. And I did exactly, you kind of walk out of the room and you think, was that just said? Allow? But the good thing is, not only did the university allow it, they celebrated it. And not only have they celebrated it, I can actually say that I have a bank of mentors, coaches, and sponsors in this room that have been pivotal to my journey. And interestingly, they don't all look like me. So a round of applause to you all, actually, because some of you are in this room. So my final point is I asked each of the panel members to just share with us, whether it's a piece of prose or poetry, a saying, whatever, something very short that they can kind of use as a vehicle, as it were, to speak to the essence of their identity. So I'm going to start at the opposite end. So I'll begin with Rutendo, and I shall ask you to share your piece.
Okay, so this is not original from me. This is a quotation from Shirley Chisholm. So, open quote, "We must reject not only the stereotypes that others hold of us, but also the stereotypes that we hold of ourselves." Close quotes.
I'm afraid I've gone a little bit off book because mine's a little long. But I'll keep it sweet. It was like I climbed Everest and had the summit in my sight, the flag in hand, all ready to pierce it into the top of the mountain and say, whoop-de-doo, I made it. Then an avalanche from out of nowhere swept me right back to the bottom of the mountain again. Was it worth bothering to climb again? I was exhausted. I didn't want to, but then what choice was there? By Hollyborn.
Can you do that one again and just a bit slower?
Sorry.
Yes.
It was like I climbed Everest, had the summit in my sight, the flag in hand, all ready to pierce it into the top of the mountain and say, whoop-de-doo, I made it. And then an avalanche from out of nowhere swept me right back to the bottom of the mountain again. Was it worth it bothering to climb again? I was exhausted. I didn't want to, but then what choice was there?
Thank you.
Okay, I wrote this one. As soon as I was asked to write something, think about something, I thought, I'll write it. And this is called The Mark of Our Ways. So starts. On this journey, we have various hats, some heavier than others, some fancier than others, some we bought, some that were given to us that we did not want. The interchangeability of the hats we put on leads to a disconnection, a Johari window, where some of our journeys reach their intended destination, other journeys stop short or take a detour. The mark of our ways will be indelibly etched on our minds, marking the stories we tell our peers, successors, and the journeys that we take.
The piece that I chose are lyrics. You may recognize the song, but this really sums up me. Everywhere I'm turning, nothing seems complete. I stand up and I'm searching for the better part of me. I hang my head from sorrow's state of humanity. I wear it on my shoulders, gotta find the strength in me. 'Cause I am a superwoman, yes I am. Even when I'm a mess, I still put on a vest with an S on my chest. Oh yes, I'm a superwoman.
Thank you.
That's Alicia Keys' Superwoman.
So I think we have time for a few questions from the audience. So we can see some raised hands. So we have a roving mic.
Hi, my name's Sophia. I'm from Imperial College London. I just wanted to ask a question about microaggressions because the example of hair came up multiple times, which I completely get and relate with. And I guess my question is, at what point does a microaggression just become a straight up aggression? Because I feel like the hair example has been used so often, and I guess I'm assuming that people are socially aware enough to know that's unacceptable, but it still happens. So what's that point where it's no longer a microaggression, it's just a straight up aggression?
Do you want to take that?
So I guess the question is, when does a microaggression become an assault, basically? To me, if somebody touches me outside of my permission, that's an assault, and something's going to happen. They're going to get some kind of reaction. But still focusing on microaggressions, like, I didn't really address the classroom situation because we tend to think about colleagues, excuse me, we tend to think about colleagues, but it comes from students as well. So when I go into a lecture, the first thing I do is spout off my resume because subconsciously I have to justify that I'm qualified to stand in front of these students and tell them, and to lecture them, to teach them. And one lecture was the first time I had been asked to be a guest lecturer here in the UK, and I was giving Racism 101. Excuse me. And before the class was over, one of the white students walked out, and then one of the white students went to the organizer before the class was even finished and said that I didn't know what I was talking about. And I'd like to know how many white teachers that has happened to. So microaggressions, to me, that was an assault. He didn't attack me physically. Thank you very much. He didn't attack me physically, but that was an assault on my credentials, on my right to stand in front of a classroom and teach. And just to add to that, even in America, a lot of my students, black students and white students, said I was the first black teacher that they'd ever had on the college level. So that affects us as people and as teachers, as professionals, because it implies that perhaps we aren't as qualified to stand in front of students when we have the exact same credentials as our white colleagues.
I want to just add to that, to say that, my answer to your question is it depends. And the reason I say that is because, it's not necessarily the best way to look at things, but we do have different tolerance levels. And what I might accept, walk away from, and just feel mildly irritated about is not going to be the same as Carlette or anybody else. So, the answer is contextual. It depends on how many of these microaggressions you're having to deal with until they become a capital mass. And then you, as far as you're concerned now, this is an assault. This has turned into something else. And for others, they just continue living with them until, for them, it almost becomes a normalized part of their environment. Unacceptable, but normalized. So it very much depends. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. These wonderful panel discussions. I'm Dhaneshwar Bhoi from University of Edinburgh. So connecting to the micro-validation, like is it happen, or is it really happened, or does it still prevailing, this kind of things. So connecting to the equality, Equality Act, so how far this act is capturing these kind of things?
It's a really good question. So I think the essence of that is how far does the Equalities Act go? That's 2010, and so we're talking about a long time ago. How far does this act go in capturing some of these issues that we're talking about today? So incivilities, aggressions, etc.
I have taken a look at the Equality Act, and to answer your question directly, someone petitioned, I might not have the right terminology, but someone petitioned that hair touching, again, be included in the Equality Act, and it was refused. So whatever that process was, a black woman had asked for that to be included in it. So I think that answers the question in that it's not capturing everything that it should. It's very broad, and again, it's painted with such a brush that it's so broad that it doesn't pinpoint anything, and that alone is problematic.
Yeah. I think we'd agree that there are some glaring omissions in the Act. I mean, it certainly doesn't consider things, it doesn't go as far as sort of socioeconomic status. There are a lot of issues that are not captured by the Act, and I think it's time that it is revisited. Okay, question here.
Thank you. Shola Pina Rogers, I'm with the University of Birmingham. Lovely to see you again, Deborah. I'm really interested to hear how you've experienced things, kind of, I guess, post George Floyd in relation to how you've presented and how you've been accepted at work. Like, what you've encountered. I'm asking because beforehand, I think, coming into these leadership roles in academia in particular, part of me's left at the door, and I've kind of on my journey thinking that I'm not going to do that anymore, and so I'm like a little bit, are they going to be ready for me who went to a job interview yesterday listening to Burna Boy in the lift, but still presenting properly, but I think that part of me would have been left at the gates before, and so I'm just wondering from your own experiences, do you feel, because for me it feels like when you're black and female in academia, there's a lot of, I'm terribly sorry, but I'm wondering whether, and all this kind of setup that you have to do before, which you shouldn't have to do, but you feel you have to negate so you're not called aggressive and this, that, and the other, which I feel, are you feeling that you're able to be your true, authentic selves more now than before?
I mean, for me, sometimes it feels like it's performative acceptance. So is it genuine? Not really, but because we're in the post-era, right, where we have to be acceptable. We have to show up, like we care and we listen to our colleagues. I don't know how sincere some of it comes across. So I do have a bit of a problem with some of the processes that are implemented in institutions or universities, etc., because it really does feel like tick box exercises. And perhaps in my own space where there are not many people that look like me, I often feel like a tick box exercise, like, the representative or oh, look, in our prospectus, we've got, or look, we've got, open evenings, etc. I always find myself being there. And I always then question myself, would this have happened? So it feels like performative acceptance. And yes, I can show up as more of myself, but I then wonder, what do you say once I've left the room or once you're in the comfort of your own home and we're not all there to hear what you're saying?
For me, I've not really seen a difference because I always show up as myself anyway. I think what I've seen in institutions is just a proliferation of EDI, equity, decolonisation, training. So that's much more embedded, shall we say. But no real sort of more change that you can show up and be yourself more, I suppose.
I was in research. I was doing my PhD when he was murdered. So I can't really relate to that, but I do relate to, you remember O.J. Simpson? Yeah. When he was in the white Bronco and he had his trial. I was working then, and when that verdict came down that he was not guilty, it resonated, and it was very, very precarious going to work because white people were very angry at that verdict, and so there was a lot of discomfort.
Thank you. Quite a few questions, and I've been told we can have 2 more questions. So I think you've been waiting. Oh, Wale, and then, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. It's been very insightful listening to all of you, so I really do appreciate you taking the time to come and share your thoughts with us today. My name is Wale, and I'm the Black Student Community Organizer for the Student Union. My question is, I'd like to know what you think about what else can the university do beyond having just a policy as regards to having black staff at the higher up, across board?
Listening. It's about not only having black staff in leadership positions where they will have influence over policies and strategies and commitments and things like that, not just consulting, but they actually are having a part in constructing them, but also having black lived experiences out in the open. In terms of qualitative research, we have a lot of quantitative research, we have a lot of statistics, but we don't really know the whys. We don't know the whys behind that. And I think I alluded to that earlier. We need to stop using BAME, and we need to start concentrating on disaggregating the ethnicities, because we see that, when we're talking about black students, black academics, we know that research says, X amount of black professors. It's, the least out of all ethnicities. In terms of the attainment gap, we know it's a black achievement or awarding gap. So the outcomes for black people are worse. So it's very important to understand those lived experiences,
So in the interest of time, I've been given the permission to have one more question. I know several of you have had your hands up. So we're going to take one more, and then we'll take Samir, and then and then possibly. And we'll go to the next question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. My name's Aisling. I'm the ED&I manager at City University. And I just firstly want to say thank you for actually sharing your experiences. And I think a lot of people, regardless of their backgrounds, can relate to a lot of your experiences. And as someone who has worked at a number of institutions, and I remember I've had an experience within my first couple of weeks working at my first institution from graduating out of university, where one of the directors of the department made a joke that all black people look the same. And I was so taken back by that, not knowing actually how to react to it. And a couple of days later, the director actually apologized to me, but kind of almost justified what he was saying by saying, "Oh, don't worry, it's because my wife is half Jamaican, so it's, you know, I'm not a bad person." So just thank you for actually sharing your experiences, because I think it's something that is really important for people to hear, and especially within the sector. So my question is around some of the research I've done in my postgraduate studying was around the duality of race and gender on black women's experiences progressing into leadership roles within the sector. And it's quite difficult, where a lot of research is being sort of made qualitative, the quantitative, it's all there. All of the universities are signing up to the Race Equality Charter. We're all very much aware of these experiences and being aware of what actually needs to potentially happen, but none of those actions are happening because these same conversations are being repeated, these same experiences, and every time we're in a room all together, people are still having these experiences. So it says a lot about how, as a sector and with all the universities kind of being aware of these things, something's still not clicking because these experiences are being repeated. So I think my question is, what do you feel needs to change within the sector? Because we can look for mentors, we can do all this work by ourselves, but that's placing the responsibility on us, who are the minoritized and kind of disadvantaged groups. So what does the sector need to do better at to ensure that we are supporting minoritized groups progressive in leadership?
And in the interest of time, we'll just take one answer.
Sorry.
Okay, I'll try be quick. I think just continuing to listen to people's voices is still very important, and then taking action on that. One thing that I really, really liked that the University of Westminster recently did was allow or give us a platform to actually speak. That's how I met Deborah, that's how I met Yaz. I forgot the name of it came out of Black History Month. It was the first time actually I had seen other black female colleagues in the university despite having been here for 2 years. And we got a chance to speak and actually then talk about research and actual tangible things. This is where you can get funding for this. This is how the university is going to be supportive. This is how the university is going to do this. We came away from that and said, actually, can this not be a one-off thing? Can we have a continued thing? And the university took that on board. And now we've got, I think, a monthly rolling luncheon thing. So I personally see that as having taken action, listened to us, and heard us, and I'm looking forward to seeing fruitful things come out of that, and perhaps other students actually join us beyond just the staff. So I think, it's not going to happen overnight, but it's those small incremental changes that I think will make a big difference.
Thank you. And it actually takes commitment from senior leadership to make the kinds of initiative that Rutendo is talking about happen. And that's what we have at the University of Westminster. And I won't sort of name names, but there are people sitting in the room that have been driving these initiatives from the top. And unless the sector takes this kind of top-down approach, I mean, someone once asked, do we do top-down, do we do bottom-up? We do both, but we've got to recognize that sometimes the gatekeepers and the power sits right at the top, and unless those doors are opened at the top, we're not going to get this cascade of good initiatives and the change across the sector that you're talking about. Okay, so there have been many, many more hands raised. I'm going to take one and possibly two more. So, Samir, please. And can you keep your question really brief? And I'm really sorry for the others that haven't, but please take the opportunity during the breaks to
Hi,
talk
thank
to
you.
us.
Sorry, Deborah, I'll be brief, but thank you, panellists, for a really inspiring set of reflections. I'm Samir Pandya from the School of Architecture and Cities here. I just really wanted to firstly agree and align myself with you on the idea that lived experience should be valued as a legitimate source of knowledge production and somehow seen as symptomatic of wider socio-political structures, including racism. My question really is about intersectionality, and we're talking here about the intersectionality between being black and female. But I wanted to ask also about class and the extent to which class has intersected for you in your experience. Thank you.
So I am black and I'm female and I'm also American. So that is my other intersection. And it has affected me in that as a foundational black American, I don't really find my group here in the UK. So most black people are from an African heritage or from a Caribbean heritage, which I don't identify with either one of those. And so here in the UK, I'm finding it very difficult to, as a black person, to find a place to really fit in because I don't identify with those cultural heritages. So it has affected it in the sense that, you know, I don't sometimes feel like I really fit in, that I'm an outsider. And so I've had to really carve my own way in that aspect. So yes, class definitely does. That's not really class, but that's the closest I can come to that, but yeah.
Thank you. I think class is critical to our experience. And yesterday at the PhD conference, when I spoke about a little bit of my experience, the top note for that was the fact that I came from a working class background. Not just that, but a poor working class background. And what that meant was that I entered higher education without some of the capital that was necessary to mobilize. I had to learn that as I went along, and I could see the differences between myself and my peers in terms of the constraints that the class issue, classism, created for me. So absolutely, when we think about intersections, and there are a myriad more, and the more we have is the more complex and challenging our experiences can be. And in fact, they in and of themselves are not the problem. It's how the institution kind of constructs them for us as a problem. It's the systemic issues within the institution, the fabric of the institution, that make our characteristics problematic. I'm going to take the very last question now, because you've been looking at me fiercely all the way through.
Hello, okay. Hi everyone, I'm Ravina. I work in the Students' Union with Cheyenne. So my question, I actually think it's a good one to end with. But before I ask it, thank you to the panelists. Thank you for coming, sharing your stories, and also disrupting this space. Like, mad. So my question is talking about looking at the future. And I would actually like to hear from all panelists very briefly. So what are your hopes or imaginations for the future of black women in academia?
I just think that black women are outpacing as far as higher education. Black women are outpacing, and I think that we should throw all taboos, all inhibitions, all restraints behind and just go for the gold. I'm the most educated person now in my family, male or female, on both sides of my family, and I'm encouraging my daughters to do the same, and all black women. I'm a black woman advocate, and any way that I can help and encourage or mentor, I'm there. I think that we shouldn't hold ourselves back at all. We should just go for it.
I think I'll just be short and sweet. I want to see more black women in senior leadership positions, more black women professors.
I think I'd like to see the idea that I can walk into a room and it's no longer a label that I am a black woman, it's just I am a person who so happens to be very well educated and has an opinion.
I'd like to see more of us sending the ladder down. In my own space, I started a podcast where I try and package my lessons and try and share those to African women in particular in terms of how can you also occupy this particular space.
Thank you. So we've come to the end. I started with Ajnesh Prasad, and I want to finish with him. So he says that while overt racism has demonstrably receded in line with social and legal progress, the institutional, organizational, and individual outcomes continue to detrimentally impact and demonize racialized subjects. Racism is ubiquitous. It's everywhere, and it's omnipresent. One can neither escape it nor the consequences that it engenders. We must now individually and collectively move towards unpacking its discursive perversity, for this is the only avenue to undermine its punitive effects. I started with this, I'm going to end with this. Black woman, angry black woman, sexually exotic black woman, inspirational black woman, leading black woman, superwoman. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our incredible first panel of the day. Round of applause. Huge round of applause for Deborah Husbands for organising this panel. She's a legend. Thank you so much. So what we have next is we're going to have a 15-minute comfort break. So if we could all be back here for 11:45 for our keynote speech from Jason Arday. So 11:45, we have some teas and coffees at the back. Please help yourself. It all has to go. Toilets are down the stairs. Please ask someone if you get lost. Thank you so much, everyone.